So I work for an organization called the U.S. Water Alliance, and what we're really focused on is getting everyone in this nation focused on why clean water is essential to our nation's prosperity and community well-being. And I was so glad that we started the conversation today with this 2 million folks who in this country that don't have access to clean water. And what is so troubling is that number is only the 2 million people that don't have flushing toilets in their home and they don't have faucets where clean tap water comes out. But that number is actually even greater if you think about the millions of other Americans that have drinking water sources that don't meet EPA standards, or the millions more that are struggling with paying their water bills and affordability challenges. So the challenge is truly a crisis, and what we're really trying to do is work with community leaders, water agencies around the country, the federal government to fix that.
What does that work look like on a kind of even day-to-day basis?
So at the local level, we partner with water utilities to really advance policies and practices that get at issues of affordability so that water bills are affordable. It's about how do we make infrastructure investments that get at multiple goals of both fixing the aging infrastructure that Mark just so eloquently spoke about, but doing it in a way that also makes systems resilient to climate change. It's about advocacy right now, frankly, in Washington, D.C. to make sure that any relief and recovery package includes the needs of low-income people, communities of color, and water agencies.
I want to get to the advocacy question in a moment, but first I want to bring Miguel into the conversation. Miguel, can you talk a little bit about what your group does and why the issue of clean water is important to you?
Yeah, I grew up hearing stories from my dad as he grew up very poor in his town. He would tell me stories of having to go around town collecting sawdust from sawmills to compact them into molds of that would be fire logs that would use to heat up water, to cook, to bathe. And hearing those stories really had an impact on me. My dad would always say that, he didn't grow up with a formal education, but no matter your beginnings, you always have a responsibility and you can always contribute something to society, that it is our duty to do so. As a board member of Water Education for Latino Leaders, an entity that seeks out to educate those local elected council members, supervisors, school board members, water board members, it's important. We think that everybody has the knowledge. I'm starting to learn that not one person has the answer or the solution, and that what is important is collaborative networks. So that we can find the answers together. One of the programs we do is Untapped, which seeks out to educate the local elected specifically on certain issues happening in their local regions throughout the state of California. And Mark earlier was talking about the infrastructure and the need to repair that. But I think we also have to look at the social infrastructure, because we can fix the physical, but if we're not looking at really fixing how we collaborate, how we educate ourselves, how we learn each other, and how we need to care for the thing that most important. We can do without petroleum, we could do with other resources, but water is this one thing that is so precious. So for me, it is a must that we engage in these issues. I always think about how in school we teach subjects, and I think that's important, but we also have to teach our children, and us as adults even, continue to learn how to be better beings and how to have this dialogue, because water left alone, it will heal itself. Water left alone, it will find a way to do that. But if we as humans are going to interact with it, which we will and which we want to, then we have to learn how to have better understanding of who we are as each other, so that we can protect this resource that really protects us.
Well, you mentioned repairing the social infrastructure of communities. I know organization often works with monolingual Spanish-speaking communities. Like, what does the outreach look like there? What kind of work are you doing to improve that level of social infrastructure that you just talked about?
You have to build trust, right? I think there's such a high level of distrust around, and rightfully so, right? You know, when sometimes government fails us, as it currently is at the federal level, I believe, we have to build trust. And the only way you build trust, again, is to be able to get to know the person. You know, these times have become very challenging because, you know, to the lessons of Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross of how to engage with community, you have to learn each other's story. You don't always have to be in agreement with somebody, but you have to be able to understand where they're coming from. And you have to be able to hear their story and share yours as well. And I think that is something that's hugely important in Latino communities, is being able to trust someone so that the message is something that can be augmented. And it, you know, it's difficult at times. That's one thing. The other thing, you know, I always say that I work on three things. I work on water, I work on people, and I work on smiles. And there's the last one is a metric that we really see in our community, because when things aren't good, you walk around and you could see the frowns. But when you see the smiles, that's a metric that you're on the right track. And so I think working on that last metric is an important one. And in these times, it's become very difficult. So we have to uplift those good stories while we're doing the work that we're doing to make sure that everybody has access to clean, potable, safe drinking water.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Radhika, I want to touch on something that we've kind of been dancing around in the conversation so far, which is, I think there's a sense, I know I am an environmental reporter when there's not a pandemic. And I would say there's a sense that in the 1970s, we had the kind of the country as a whole had a clean water problem, that there was a lot of open polluting, people dumping chemicals into bodies of water. And the Clean Water Act has addressed much of that. Obviously, the rivers aren't lighting on fire anymore. Can you give us a sense of what what is the nature of the clean water crisis today? What are the biggest problems? What should people think about when they hear the words clean water crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rob. So I think the clean water crisis, it's multifaceted, right? So on the one hand, if you look at the history of how our water systems developed, it was very haphazard. So, we as a nation sort of thought about this highway system, right? And we developed an interstate highway system that was very coordinated. When it comes to water, what happened was, we had expansion into the West, so there was a settlement here, we built a water system around that, and as a result, we have a very fragmented, inefficient system of water management in this country. We have 55,000 drinking water utilities, 18,000 wastewater utilities. And so that is one of the big challenges or crises that we face. And especially with COVID, right, it's compounding because many of these small systems don't have the financial resilience to be able to continue.
And how does that fragmentation affect water quality? Is it that they're not affluent enough, or is it that basically everyone has to purchase the same equipment over and over, they can't share access to water resources?
All of those things. It's the economies of scale challenge that we face. And now in the context of COVID-19, a lot of these small systems are reporting that they don't have the financial resilience to go 6 months if they don't have assistance from the federal government or from the state. So that is a huge challenge. I think another cause of the crisis is that, as Mark was talking about, this infrastructure is aging. I'm calling in from San Francisco today, and we literally have red brick pipes underneath this global city because they were put down in the gold rush era. So the infrastructure is aging. The federal government is an absent partner. We only get 4% of our need of the need for water infrastructure from the federal government. And I think it's important, especially at this moment, and the COVID tracker that you and many others have really been looking at the racial inequities embedded into everything, and we see that in water too. That 2 million number. What we know is that race is the single biggest predictor of who's going to have water access in this country and who isn't. So African Americans have a disproportionate lack of access. They're also dying at a rate of 2.5 times the national average when it comes to COVID deaths. If you look at the Navajo Nation, 30 to 40% of the Navajo Nation doesn't have drinking water in their homes. And they also have one of the highest per capita incidences of COVID. So it's all—
And what does life look like when you don't have drinking water in your home? Are people walking to communal wells?
You are walking to wells. You are hauling, there's trucks that haul water to your community if you're lucky to have that. You're buying bottled water at outrageous prices. That bottled water during COVID has not been in convenience stores in these rural communities. So it is a hard existence.
How is, Miguel, I want to toss the conversation to you. How is COVID affecting your work, and how is COVID affecting your outreach too? Because obviously there's a lot of work that used to be done by social organizations, by nonprofits, that is now just impossible because it was face-to-face work.
Yeah, it's interesting because as COVID is impacting more the communities, the poor communities and communities of color, so is the issue of delivering clean water. I would say though that we are resilient communities. And so the approach of working together, right? It's we're all in this together, and you see the work that's happening around providing food for your neighbor and for others. You see people who they themselves don't have enough for their families, but somehow they figure out to get enough for their neighbors as well. And so I think this issue of how the outreach has impacted. We continue to do what we've always done, which is stay in touch with each other. It's harder because the technology that's available, not everybody has access to. But we forget about this other technology that's the telephone, right? Just to pick up the phone and call someone. We don't have to get on a visual conference call to get a hold of somebody. And so being able to text someone, being able to call someone, being able to drive by someone's house just to check in on them is very important. It's important to come back to those things. I also wanted just to mention that there's this issue of premise plumbing that's coming. And we look at the large infrastructure that delivers water to our homes and to the buildings, medical buildings and schools. But there's this plumbing underneath all those facilities that we don't have a plan for. And that is the next, in California, we have a human right to water that was passed in 2012. And we're almost 10 years in, and we're still working towards making sure that there's teeth in it and that there's funding. Mm-hmm.
And when you say a premise plumbing, in other words, there's aging infrastructure kind of built into the ground floor of these buildings, and that is not part of the public infrastructure that we discussed.
That is not part of the public. Yeah. This is going to be something that the owner of that 100 dwelling building, that if that person currently is a slumlord, how do you think? And there's no money for it. So I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about, and many others here at the Luskin, UCLA Luskin School of Public, they've been thinking about this as well. So while we need to do the macro, we also need to keep in mind the micro infrastructure that if they need to go in parallel. So I just wanted to highlight that's something that we also need to be paying attention to.
That's really interesting. Radhika, you mentioned during earlier answer that city budgets and these fragmented water systems are starting to be affected by COVID. Can you talk us through what the real world implications of that will look like? Is this something we saw during the Great Recession? Like, what does it mean? What does a budget crunch mean for city water system or a fragmented water system?
Um, it's going to be a compounding crisis on what we're already seeing is the short answer. But, you know, what we are seeing as far as water utilities around the country, they're seeing tremendous revenue losses as office buildings remain closed, convention centers are closed. The projection is that by 2021, the water utilities will see about a $30 billion loss in revenue. At the same time, they're seeing increasing costs because they're putting moratoriums on water shutoffs, which they should absolutely be doing. They're restoring service to people that don't have it, and they're taking on all kinds of new costs related to emergency operations. So revenues declining, costs are increasing, and then again, the federal government is only contributing about 4% to the needs. So I think what will happen is that at the local level, water agencies will have to increase rates to be able to cover costs, to be able to make capital investments that will further increase the affordability challenge for working families, low-income people, communities of color. And then I think, you know, what I really worry about, Rob, is that we're going to defer those capital projects that aren't the immediate needs. They're not the sewer pipe that broke today, right? It's going to be, we're going to defer the investments to manage for things like sea level rise, flooding. And so we're just going to be kicking the can down the line, or however you want to say it. And so that is, I think, the real worry is that there'll be a compounding crisis of another public health challenge because we're going to continue to defer that investment and that maintenance.
And those levels of very high investment capital infrastructure, those were obviously supposed to, not obviously, but those were supposed to be one of the, a goal of the Trump administration, these big infrastructure investments. I am familiar with what I've seen from my beat, but is that something you've seen looking at the country overall? Have we seen this wave of infrastructure investment?
No, we haven't. Unfortunately, I think that was one of the areas that at least the water community was excited about under this administration. I will say it's been a disappointment. And frankly, it's been a disappointment that Congress has also not included water in any of the relief and recovery packages. You know, for example, the Atlanta airport received, you know, close to $250 million in stimulus support. What did the water department in Atlanta receive? Nothing. And it's not to say that the airport isn't important, but what is more essential than water? I do feel optimistic about the Build Back Better plan that was released by Vice President Biden last week. I hope that
this is his infrastructure plan that includes some climate aspects too, I think.
Yep, climate, energy, infrastructure. And what I really hope is that as we move further into the general election season, that we're going to see robust infrastructure plans, not only coming out of our presidential candidates, but also in state races at the local level. And it's really, I think, an imperative for us to, as citizens, to talk about what's at stake if we don't invest.
Thank you. Last question is a question from a viewer. I want to, he says, it's Thomas, he says, to get to collaborative networks around water infrastructure and other community requirements, I believe that we must have a shared goal of promoting public benefits. How do we get there? And I want to ask you to answer briefly, Radhika first and Miguel, not only how do we get there, but where should we go on water? What's the, if there's one thing that we could be doing, what is it, and how can we get that public spiritedness behind it?
Miguel, would you like to go?
I said, sure. I said this early on. I think we have, I mean, it's sort of, the answer is sort of within the question, that we have to be able to work collaboratively. Water will take care of itself. And there is really not one thing other than if we're not taking care of the less affluent person, of the poor person, of the person of color that doesn't have the resources to have clean, affordable water, then, I mean, what is the long-term benefit of it? And we, you know, Mark or someone else was alluding to earlier, you know, this can't be about you know, ourselves. This has to be the shared good. What is the shared good? And without water, we don't, I mean, the issues are just going to be exacerbated without clean water, more specifically.
Radhika and Miguel, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. Thank you for joining us today.